Hello again. Welcome back to the MIT AI Policy Forum Summit. We now move on into our first panel conversation on the topic of AI rules beyond national borders. This conversation will be led by Professor Jeremias Adams-Prassi from Oxford University. Jeremias, off to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Louise, and thank you everyone for joining us for the first panel in this exciting lineup today. I am a professor at law at the University of Oxford, and together with a team of computer scientists and lawyers, I work on exploring regulatory options for responsible AI, both in the European Union and beyond. But as I hope we'll be able to convince you today, this is not just an academically interesting question. There's lots of really important work going on in jurisdictions across the world. And I think it's really important that we cannot overstate the importance of getting this right, both in terms of the significant past dependencies when it comes to AI regulation, but also the really, really important and complex trade-offs that we need to think very carefully through. Now, one particular challenge that keeps cropping up is the fact that we're looking at a global phenomenon when it comes to thinking about regulating AI. Yet at the same time, regulation usually tends to be focused at the national or the regional level. There's potentially reasons for that. It's a challenge for citizens, for regulators, for developers. On the one hand, it's important to respect local traditions, local political economy, local democratic choices. But on the other hand, too much fragmentation, too much particularization could be really harmful to innovation and development. So that's a tough question. How do we square that circle between, on the one hand, respecting local choices, but also making sure that we don't hamper innovation, we don't hamper development? It's a really tough question I spend a lot of time thinking about, but I'm really glad that I don't have to present you with the answer today. It's a challenge I'm looking forward to debating with a brilliant panel this morning. We've got about an hour or so for the conversation between us, but I'll also make sure to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So please, as we go along, if there's things that really tickle your fancy, keep the questions coming, pop them in the chat on the screen below you, and I'll make sure to leave plenty of space for us at the end to discuss them. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to today's exciting lineup of speakers who very kindly decided to join us. First up is Angela Kane. Angela is a senior advisor to NTI and serves as the NTI Samnam Distinguished Fellow between 2021 and 22. Her particular focus was on initiatives to reduce global catastrophic biological risks by strengthening international coordination in preventing and responding to these devastating events. Angela has also previously served as the UN Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, as Under Secretary General for Management, and as the High Representative for Disarmament. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today, Angela. Our second panelist is Hiroaki Kitano. Hiroaki is President and CEO of Sony Computer Science Laboratories, Inc. He's also the Executive Vice President of Sony Group Corporation and the CEO of Sony AI, particularly relevant, of course, for this panel today. Hiroaki also serves as co-chair of Japan's Advisory Council on AI Strategy Implementation and is a member of Singapore's Advisory Council on the Ethical Use of AI and Data. Thank you very much indeed, Hiroaki, for joining us this morning. Last but by no means least, we're joined by Elham Tabassi. Elham is the Chief of Staff in the Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Elham leads the Trustworthy Responsible AI program at NIST, developing AI risk management frameworks, and she's received a number of high-ranking awards, including the Department of Commerce Gold Medal in 2003, ANSI's 2012 Next Generation Award, and the Women in Biometrics Award in 2016 for her contribution to biometrics. Elham, again, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. So over the course of the next hour, given the fact that overall we're thinking about how we can craft AI rules beyond national borders, I thought of three clusters of questions or three clusters of topics we might want to explore. First, to think about surveying the existing landscape. Lots of different jurisdictions are already starting to have different rules and regimes. Let's spend some time exploring what's going on there. The second thing I really want us to focus on is the need for inclusive global conversations. Because again, given the sort of remit of the technologies we're talking about and the kind of lighthouse effects that regulation can often have, I think it's really important that even at this stage, we focus in particular on getting a very inclusive global conversation going. And then finally, a more practical question. I'm just a professor, I'm interested in theory and think this through. What's really good is that we've got lots of practical expertise on this panel today. So in the third part of our conversation, I really wanted to focus about how can we move in practice towards international frameworks for AI policy. So if everybody's happy with that, let's first kick off with looking at the existing landscape. And I think it might be interesting to start here, but drawing a contrast between what's going on in Europe on the one hand and the United States on the other. So on the one hand, there's already a great deal of AI rulemaking occurring across Europe. And Europe really, I think at this point, in terms of actually putting out legally binding measures, is one of the key players. Whether it's things like the GDPR or the enforce or ongoing discussions, particularly about the EU AI Act, I think what are some of the lessons that we can learn from what's going on there? And in drawing these lessons, in particular, how can you contrast that with what's going on in the US? So in the US, we also have various legislative and regulatory initiatives, such as the National AI Initiative Act, but there the approach seems to be much more one of sort of non-binding guidance approaches. How at all can we think about making these kind of approaches compatible with the very binding rules we see across the Atlantic, given the fact that we're looking at two very significant markets for AI? Elham, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you so very much, Jeremiah. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be part of this wonderful conversations and discussion along with very eminent panelists. As Jeremiah said, my boss, NIST director, Dr. Lacasio, sends her regrets for not being able to be here, and I'll do my best to be a competent replacement for her. But let me first point out that you're absolutely right, that there is a flurry of activities and in a policy domain, standard, in technology across the Atlantic in the area of AI. New AI technologies are leading to a wide range of innovations that can benefit nearly all aspects of our lives, from commerce to transportation to health to cybersecurity. And every day we're hearing of new extraordinary innovations and advancement, as well as concerns. And that's why having a flexible, structured, measurable process to understand, manage, and measure risks is really important and timely. And that's where NIST comes in with the role of building trust in AI. And that's not any different from what we do for any part of other technologies. And we do that by advancing measurement science, advancing standards that are clear, implementable, and developed in a consensus manner. And our interdisciplinary laboratory is a very fertile ground to practice AI and AI disciplines and AI expertise and AI tools to help us understand the limits and capabilities of technology. But as you noted, the landscape of AI policy is evolving, and we see different activities all across the globe. In United States, as you point out, the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act of 2020 outlines central directions for AI in US, and the same piece of legislation asked NIST to develop AI risk management framework by January 2023. Our approach to addressing these issues from this point of view is through the AI risk management framework, which is a voluntary framework. It tries to provide a structured, pro-innovation, measurable process for understanding, measuring, and managing risk at all stages of the AI lifecycle, from design to development to deployment to procurement. I also want to note that NIST is a non-regulatory agency, and the NIST AI RMF is law and regulation agnostic. And also point out that for both all the international frameworks, regardless of they are voluntary or not, good technical standard, good specifications can be the core of how to achieve trustworthy, responsible AI. And one other thing that I want to point out that here in US, we have a bottom-up voluntary approach with meaningful public-private engagement, and that has served us very well in terms of striking the right balance of innovations and managing risk that Jeremiah pointed out at the beginning. And finally, I want to say that in regards to different approaches in US and EU, when it comes to the AI, there is much that we all agree on. Both United States and European Union seek a rights-preserving, innovation-friendly, risk-based approach that maximize the benefits of AI in a inclusive and equitable manner for everybody. So with that, I thank you for this opportunity, and I thank you for having me in this conversation.
Thank you very much indeed, Elham, for kicking us off by really highlighting some of those key challenges we want to think about. Hiroaki, what's your take on the challenges we're facing?
Yep. Yeah, I think like a really interesting move by this like EU AI Act, which actually classify the AI into the several categories. In particularly, they want to impose relatively strict regulations on what they call the high risk AI. So also like a discussion on the what really categorize the high risk AI. But there are whole kind of a discussion to be made, and then of course like this is still in the process, and then we probably have all the kind of dialogue. I think Japanese government is talking to the EU communities and how we can try to harmonize this, and then try to provide like our view, whether it's not clear like how much of that will be reflected or not reflected. At the same time, like we have like a regular conversation with some of the EU countries. For example, like end of October, we have annual AI conference between Germany, France, and Japan. This has been going on for the last 3 years, and then I think it's the 4 years by now. And then this year, this will take place in person in Tokyo, talk about like a human-centric AI, and then all kind of discussions forum on the how AI policy would be promoted or regulated at all levels. So there are like a lot of discussion going on in between like a EU community and Japan, and I think we start seeing the conversation going on between the US and Japan as well. But at the same time, like that is the focus more onto the privacy protecting AI or privacy protecting machine learning in the area rather than the regulatory aspects, because like a US. As far as I understand, it is more on the promoting AI rather than regulating specific aspects of the AI at this moment. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's a very interesting difference in terms of attitude, how we approach things. The Japanese government has like an AI strategy policy, which initial version was the enacted on the 2019, and there's like a revised version 2022, which are focusing on the more education side, like how we're going to get like a talent pool for the AI research and development, as well as the literacy on AI. One of the big issues in AI is some people people might actually consider AI to be really like a kind of magical wand or like a black box, so like they expect too much on AI or afraid too much. So that actually impacts like public view on how they approach AI, and potentially implicates in the policy decision making down the road. So I think it's really important. Like our position is really important to make sure like people understand AI and take it as a useful tool which benefit people. At the same time, some of the risk of the AI will be taken care not specifically by the AI specific legislations, but will be generally taken care by the Privacy Protecting Act. So I think that's the reality of the policy decision making at this moment. At the same time, Japanese government as well as the Japanese Economic Federation, like a Kane, issued the guideline. What is the best practice, for the AI, like a human-centric AI guidelines, and then so all kind of guideline for the industry to take a look, and then to be like a guiding principle. So I think like those pretty much consistent with how we view AI regulatory policy, or like best practice with AI in the US and Europe. We have been really the regular member for the partnership in AI and a GPAI as well. So it's pretty consistent. At the same time, if you look at the much broader landscape, what is the policy for China India, Southeast Asia, or like other countries. So I think like whether we're gonna have like a harmonization at the global scale or like what is the cultural difference or regional difference, it hasn't been solved yet. And I think that would be the reality at this moment. And then probably like that's a point like we might want to look into the issues in coming years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hiroaki. And you've already touched so richly on lots of the questions that I've still got burning for all of our panelists. Before we open up to that broader global conversation, Angela, could I get your sense of what you make of the sort of transatlantic differences, given your expertise on both sides of the Atlantic? I'd be really interested to see what you make of it.
Thank you very much, Jeremias, and I'm really happy to be here on this panel. And I thank my two panelists who've already spoken because they've already opened up the whole subject. And what I find very interesting is that when you look at the landscape, you really see that there are only a couple of players who are very important in this sense. And that's, of course, the US, and that's Europe and China. But on the other hand, it's also the G7 that has made tremendous advances. And I think that Hiroaki has already alerted to the group that was constituted among those. But what I find really, really interesting is that when you look at how is this developed, then you can see that the traditional models of government really cannot be applied. You have to find new models because it's not only governments, but it's also, of course, it's private industry. So how do you build them in? And I can give you the experience if I participated in the elaboration of these EU rules that were taken in Brussels. And what I found really interesting, and here I'm speaking from the viewpoint of having been a long time international civil servant and diplomat dealing with member states, that in the EU, they had a group of people who were actually subject matter experts, and they were industry experts, but they're not really government representatives. And that made a tremendous difference. And the difference was really that we were kind of led down a path where I think that some of the parameters were already set, and they just basically wanted us to validate them. And I thought that some of us were not really happy with the whole outcome, what it is. But the difficulty is, and you already emphasized that in the beginning, Jeremias, is that you have EU binding regulations and you have in the US, you have non-binding regulations. And that is very fragmented. This is a very fragmented approach. And I think, to my mind, having lived in the United States for a long time, is also because of the power of algorithms, the power of AI, there is a it's very easy to sue companies or to sue governments for actually the damage that it has done to us. So in case if you have binding regulations, you have to take that into account, that you might have actually legal steps that might be taken if there is what is perceived to be an abuse of the system. But the other interesting part that I find is that it isn't only a government regulation, but what you have in the US, what you don't have in Europe, I find, is you have in the US, you have a lot of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations that actually deal with ethical approaches to AI. What can we do to improve the decision-making in AI? Let us open the black box, etc. That you do not have in Europe. And I find that interesting because there just isn't the same activism, if I can call it that, because I also believe that there's more faith in the government. The government is doing basically what is right. And that is, to my mind, a tremendous difference. And I've seen that ever since having moved back to Europe a couple of years ago. But the other problem that we need to think about is that it is not only a scientific approach, or it is not only an ethical approach, but I think that when you look at it, it's really also an economic approach. And when you look at China, for example, China very much looks at it in terms of like, it's an economic competition. It's something that is very much rooted in industry, or particularly in government industry, if I can call it that, about China. And that is a fundamental difference. When you look at the EU, what did the EU do? The EU looked at it in terms of not only the companies, where maybe you should look at, should one sell or should one allow to buy a company that deals with AI in Europe? But also it was a matter of training people, of education, of basically saying we need to expand the pool of people who are working on this. So the approach is totally different. I don't hear that in the US. I don't at all hear that in China. It's a very, very different approach, because in China, I do think it's a matter of the competition, it's the economic empowerment, it's the economic gain that one could make. And that, I think, could also be true in other countries, like, for example, China, which Hiroaki has mentioned. So there is a very, very fundamental difference in approach when you look at the various main players. And what I find, and I know we come to that, is that the rest of the world is really more of a bystander, but they're not a doer. And that is very difficult to later on bridge the gap. Exactly how do you do that? How do you join up with those who later on make progress? Oh, back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Angela. And we're about to get on this broader global perspective. There's just one thing it struck me that actually was sort of resonating through all three of your contributions, and that is there's another tension, and that is between omnibus regulation and sector-specific regulation, right? And this idea, do we want to regulate AI as a technology, as it's then employed in lots of different contexts, or do we want to regulate AI in the context of healthcare, or in the context of the workforce, or in the context of financial services? So maybe we just have a quick fire round in terms of your impressions as to how different jurisdictions are going about it, and what you think might be the most promising way forward.
I can take that on right away, and I will tell you that I think it is much easier to do a specific sector approach rather than an omnibus approach where everything is done. That is absolutely impossible. And having dealt with that in a case where a lot of people are sitting around the table, it's impossible because there's such different perceptions as to what exactly you're trying to do. If you do a sector-specific approach, that is actually very promising because you're narrowing it down and you're getting the players around the table who are not only kind of the global players, but also the sector players. And they have a much better understanding of what is happening there. So in my mind, it's the only way to go. But what I find very frustrating is very often it is so process oriented. So people focus on the process, and I think one ought to focus on the outcome, and that doesn't always happen, unfortunately.
Thank you, Angela. That certainly plays into my intuitions. And I think sort of in the EU, one of the tensions we're seeing with the AI Act at the moment is that by trying to be an omnibus instrument, we run into all sorts of challenges. I don't know whether Elham or Hiroaki, you've got thoughts to join us on this?
Yeah, I think I agree on this sector-based approach because, like, AI, basically it's machine learning. That means like we have to have like tons of data, and then how we handle data is really depends on the sector-based. Like, if you want to have like a large-scale medical data, you have to adhere to like all the medical record regulations, and then whether that can be going in trans-border, or you have to have like retained all the information within the territory, but like it still wants to have like a integrated machine learning or not. And if you go to like e-commerce data, they have to have like a really different kind of transactions and different kind of regulations as well. So it's really what kind of data you want to have, and what kind of like handling of the data restriction in terms of the how you protects the privacy. At the same time, like sometimes you have to go to trans-border. So I think that's really depends on the the kind of applications or like industry. So I think it's really sector-based to be the proper approach, I would say. At the same time, what the EU trying to do is that they categorize that as like which one is in high risk and things like so. Like it's more an omnibus approach, but at the same time, like in a way, their categorizations of the risk profiling, they're trying to cover the sector base, but at the same time, each sector has a very specific way of handling data and regulatory constraints. So I think like at the in the precision discussions, I think we should go for like a sector based.
Thank you, Hiroaki. Elham, I'm now secretly hoping you're going to come out batting very strongly for an omnibus approach. So this doesn't look like I've set it up just to pander to my own prejudice. But what do you make of it?
I'll try to be short. No doubt, AI is all about context and use case, and no doubt risk management in different use cases and contexts and sectors would be a bit different than others. And add to that, that for each of the sectors, we already have some laws and regulations around the globe on the book on, for example, financial sector had certain laws and regulations. Our approach with AI risk management was that while at the end, and as Angela said, bringing the domain experts, the people that know that is really important, we use the language of verticals versus horizontal. Building those verticals, building those sector-based are really, really important. There is a need to have a horizontal, a sort of foundations that give a shared understanding, the interoperable lexicon on understanding terms such as risk management, what constitutes trust, what are the taxonomy of risk. We all often use the same term meaning two different things. And that's true for things such as bias, for example, that in different sectors interpret bias in AI differently. When we add other type of AI risks, such as explainability and interpretability, then it becomes sort of a wild west of terminology. So the approach that we have taken with AI RMF is to do the horizontal, to build a high-level guidance that can be applied, that give the foundations for risk management for every sectors, and then builds profile of AI RMF that basically tailor outcome-based statements and guidance to the certain sectors, and bring their own flavors, their own slant, and they all import different risk categories and risk appetite and risk tolerance. And obviously, development of those verticals cannot be done without the domain experts involved in that. So we are working on the horizontal. We have a call for AI RMF profiles, and what it would look like, it would look like a guidance for risk management of AI for hiring, or risk management of AI for credit underwriting, so on and so forth. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, one of the big strands that we've already seen coming out of our discussions so far is this need for a broader, more inclusive global conversation. So AI is clearly having an impact, very differently perhaps, but nonetheless an impact on every country across the planet. So the next kind of series of questions I'd like us to explore is, what can we actually do in concrete terms to foster a much more inclusive global AI policy conversation? What can different countries around the world do to, on the one hand, as we've already said, square that circle of asserting their own values, their own democratic choices, their own preferences, amongst a much broader dynamic of, a global technological revolution and the need for, one set of standards potentially to really foster innovation. Hiroaki came through very clearly in your early conversations, as you've got lots of insight here. Would you like to kick us off in this round?
Yep. Yeah, I think this is a really important issue from the multiple aspects. One is the how you want to make sure like a basis to be the same. There are some fundamental principles that need to be kept regardless of the regions, really the fundamental part. And then probably like a different layer, some layer up above would be like how we can reflect the local difference, the cultural or the political differences as well. So for example, I think a US student, very strongly about the individual privacy, the individual right, where the Asian country typically tend to actually wait a little bit more for the social order as well. And that's a slight difference. But at the same time, there should be really something fundamental to be kept anywhere, regardless of the how you weigh in the value system as well. That's so how we're gonna actually harmonize some cultural and social differences in the regulatory, global regulatory framework will be the one to be discussed. And the other thing is this is coupled with all the technological thing. What's going on right now in AI is emergence of the foundation model. We have been thinking about domain-specific model, large-scale domain-specific model is the way to go. At the same time, what's going on right now is a large-scale model, regardless of what, may be able to be a better than the domain-specific model. I mean, of course, you need to have a domain-specific knowledge, but if you actually integrate domain-specific knowledge, a much broader data set might actually exhibit the better performance. And you see a emergence of the, for example, a Google Lambda or a stable diffusion, which is more the image generation. But what's the implication of this kind of technology is if you got the high quality data at the large scale, then you can moving towards artificial general intelligence rather than specific domain specific model. So if that is actually the case, this has several implications. One is the country or company access largest data, and if we're able to create a loop that continuously generate the data and verify that, and then create a use case and get a feedback, it would be that single winner. This could be a multiple countries with a company, and But like if any countries whose population size and market is not big enough won't be able to get there. You know, what the only thing they can do without having like a broader data access is to actually subscribe to the large scale data holder, like a big AI company. So that means like their service, or like you know, how they actually you know, provide a service to the local users really depends on someone outside of the country. So for those countries, for them to be able to create a decent AI and then have any kind of control for their citizens is to ensure the large scale data access, probably most likely the cross border. Otherwise, you know, the data size getting from their own population is too small. So I think this is really the important political implications, and then also the practical business implications. You know, for the people to have the opportunity or probably control over the data, you need to have some crossover, you know, cross-boundary data access, and then you know, ownership of access right, or like a protection measure, which is very complicated. But you know, otherwise, what we're going to see is the domination of the AI service by someone who will be able to access a large scale data and able to provide the ecosystem to be continue to feed the data and provide an AI service. So I think it's really invite the you know, all kind of tension in the future. And I think it would be great to have like an international framework, probably using the international forum of any kind, for example, like a World Economic Forum or other forum, to be able to come up with the kind of consensus on how we can enable smaller countries to be able to access data, or make you know, create like some data control over their own population.
Thank you, Hiroaki. And I think we've had the understatement of the day so far today when you call it challenging or difficult to think about cross-border data access. One of my postdocs is specializing in that field and has written a whole book on it. And even as a law professor, it does my head in terms of the complexities of accessing data. So I think there's a lot of work for lawyers. Whether it's a good thing or not, I leave for the panel and the audience to judge. Angela, you've had lots of experience in multilateral and international fora. What do you make of this need for inclusive global conversations?
I think it's very interesting because Hiroaki, of course, positioned himself and sort of talked about the big data and the access to data, which is, of course, extremely important. But the question to me is always, in an international organization, or international multilateral environment, how do you get the conversation started? And when I look at the charter, for example, it sort of says, you know, it should achieve cooperation in solving international problems, you know, of all matters. And then the question is, of course, is AI an international problem? I mean, that's the first question that one needs to ask. And then the second one is, how do you actually tackle this? How do you actually open the debate in a multilateral setting? And how, you know, how do you go about it? Who's going to champion these? But on the other hand, the problem is also in the international organization is, how do you deal with private industry? You know, the UN is an organization of sovereign states. They don't really like to deal with private industry, particularly those smaller countries that were mentioned, that basically feel that they are smothered by this, that they are oppressed by this, because they don't really feel that they have an eye level with either the companies or with the big countries that are dealing primarily in AI matters. And then the other question is, I mean, should it be on access or should it be on ethical considerations? So there are a lot of questions that are really coming up that are important. But what has happened in the UN, for example, is there has been a long time effort since 1998 or something, right, close to 25 years, which was pushed on in terms of what is the threats that are posed and the malicious use of technology. It wasn't AI then, but it was something that was framed as a military question, and that's been going on in the first committee, the Security Committee, for a number of years. Now, the first time the Security Council ever talked about emerging technologies, as they called it, was in May last year. That's the very first time it was ever done. Guterres, the Secretary General, has done actually quite a bit to put the issue on the agenda. You know, he had this roadmap for digital cooperation, which was following a panel that he had, a high-level panel that was headed by Melissa Gates and Jack Ma, and they elaborated this roadmap. But on the other hand, when you look at what is developed there, it is very, very general. There's nothing very specific. There's a lot of access to developing countries. There's a lot of equity in terms of how people should deal with AI, etc. But there's very little in terms of a normative framework that could actually be developed then. But Guterres has also called for a ban on lethal autonomous weapon systems. And that is something that is also has to be seen in here. It is not only the big data, but it's also other issues. And you sort of talk about, Hiroaki, about cultural and regional differences. And that's very true. But I think it is also true that the smaller countries basically don't feel that they have a level playing field in this, that they are greatly diminished, that they are greatly pushed aside, and that basically things are decided over their heads. And that's a really important point of view. And when you say, for example, that maybe the UN isn't the right forum, but maybe one could look at, for example, the World Economic Forum, that's again the same problem that I have with that. That's a forum of basically the wealthy countries. It is not really one where other countries have access to. And so you could never make that work and make it acceptable in the United Nations. And the third problem that I have with all of this is that when you look at who are diplomats are not AI experts. Diplomats are very often lawyers, or maybe they've studied history, or maybe they've studied some other disciplines. But on the other hand, all of a sudden they're expected to come up and pronounce themselves, have an opinion on this in a forum where they're basically outclassed in terms of the knowledge. And that I find very, very difficult. And when I look at the UN in general, there is a multitude of actors. There's a multitude of actors that is working on that. I mean, you remember there is UNESCO, and they adopted a normative framework last year, which was agreed to by everyone, including China. And you know, US right now is not a member of UNESCO, but that was a normative framework on ethical use of AI, which can be used as a basis, let's say, for further discussions. But you also have ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. And here again, the politics come into play, because ITU is a purely technical agency. I mean, they set radio frequencies and issues like that. But they have a Chinese national who has been elected for 2 terms, and his term is coming to an end. And now the question is there 2 people who are competing for that? And one is a Russian who is a former Huawei executive, and the other one is an American candidate who is the current Deputy Secretary General. And these decisions are going to be taken right now. And this will be very closely watched, because this again comes down to the competition as to what happens in this. And even though, as I said, it's a technical agency, but there's a lot of influence. ITU has done for a number of years this issue about AI for good. And they have basically done a big study into having a feedback from about 46 agencies, which they published and sort of said, this is what needs to be done in the field of AI. So there is a normative function that ITU feels very strongly they have. And this is why the election of this new Director General is extremely political, and it's happening right now. So, you know, this is basically something that we have to keep in mind, but we do have to also always think about, if you want to do this normative, if you want to have regulations, if you want to elaborate rules, start by the sector, but start also with everyone on the table, and not just with the major players in this, because that is going to backfire, because it'll be resented and it'll be opposed by a lot of member states. Back to you, Jeremias.
Thank you very much indeed, Angela. And actually, I think there's a really interesting question there for Elham, as somebody who is actually an expert on the sort of more technical side of things. Is actually the way forward through these kind of very difficult geopolitical waters to focus on technical standards, say, you know, like the AI risk management frameworks, on which you lead such interesting work?
Thank you a lot for the questions, and a lot of really great point has been raised so far. And I have been participating in development of technical standard within international standard development organizations, not ITU, but things like such as ISO. And I can see increasingly standard development is becoming as you said, Jeremiah, a geopolitical issue. My heart burns up with all of the attention to standard now. So if I may, going back to the question and address several things that was mentioned. Number one, international engagement, extremely important, and that's what we are continuing, expanding, strengthening our international engagement. In terms of the engagement with the private sector, at least in the development of the AI RMF. I should have mentioned at the very beginning that NIST is a agency under the Department of Commerce with the sole mission of helping with US industrial competitiveness and improve quality of life. So the bloodline, really something really important to the work that we do is collaboration with the whole industry. So as part of the AI RMF and Angelo, back to your point about inclusiveness and having a seat around the table for everybody who wants to participate, we think that's really important. And that diversity goes for diversity of thoughts, multidisciplinary approach of having engineers, mathematicians, but also sociologists, cognitive scientists, lawyers, all of them involved in at least for the AI development of the AI RMF. And we have been grateful for the community engagements. In terms of the international discussions and engagement, while we're working on the AI RMF that, many, including our European colleague, calls it a very technical response to AI risk management framework. We are also working with our colleagues through the Trade and Technology Council, Quad. We're working with Japan, India, Australia through Quad. As part of the discussions in Indo-Pacific Economic Forum with Singapore and others, trying to examine and explore shared approaches to risk management and trustworthy, responsible AI. We also have bilateral conversations with, UK, with India on both on collaborations and cooperations on foundational research that builds the foundations and core building blocks for advancing science, but also provide quantitative contributions, technical contributions for policy discussions. I guess I'm looking to my notes to make sure that we have I answered all of the things that I wrote down. So just summarizing that international engagements is really important, and we need to keep our technical scientists work with each other on understanding and building the shared lexicon, interoperable methods and approaches for understanding and measuring risk, but also at the policy discussions. And our role from NIST is to provide the right quantitative technical data for policymakers and regulators in the space. If I can just add a couple of other things about the large models, and I'll be very brief, and data access and all this. I agree with all of that, but also I'm very hopeful that, one of the things that we say about AI RMF is that we're trying to operationalizing values and get the discussions at the very design stage on how to develop rights-preserving technologies that are privacy by design, secure by design, bias mitigated by design. And so advancement of the technology is really dear and near to our heart. And we have seen things such as transfer learning, true that the building of the large foundational model is only in the hands of a few, but access to those models and the ability and the knowledge to transfer learn those large models into other applications, I think are exciting news and something that I'm hoping that can make all of these things more equitable. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Elham. And that really, I think, brings us to our big final question that sort of, I hope, will draw things together. And that is, what are the kind of international frameworks, whether they're agreements, whether they're formal treaties, that we need to take AI policy forward in a way, both protecting a lot of the interests we've been talking about, but also ensuring we've got this level playing field that supports innovation, supports new tech developments? And I think there's both a sort of normative dimension to that, kind of, what do we actually need? Do we need sectoral approaches? How narrow, broad should these be? And there's also a sort of more practical, empirical question, right? How feasible, how likely is it that actually such international treaties would actually be created in today's geopolitical realities. What about this competition between different states, potentially in terms of attracting AI investment, AI technology? So both in terms of the normative dimension and the more empirical dimension of that question, what do we think at the end of our conversation? Angela, do you want to take us away?
You know, I spend a lot of time in the UN, and for me, it's always the glass is half full and not half empty. So it's always my hope that there's something that can be achieved. And I know it can, but it's extremely difficult. And let me just tell you out frankly that I don't think that the UN itself can establish rules and regulations for AI. It can do it maybe for ethical use in terms of recommendations, but it may be able to do it in various sectors if it's very specific and it's very technical. But on the other hand, as a global framework, as a global rule, as a global regulation on AI, I don't think it's possible. Now, you know that earlier this year, the Secretary General appointed a special envoy on technology. And mind you, it's not AI, it's on technology. And he's basically implementing this roadmap for digital cooperation that I told you came out of this high-level board. But when you look at his mandate, the mandate is basically to support global cooperation on AI, to support, not to lead, not to pronounce, whatever, to support global cooperation on AI, but not to draw up rules and regulations. Very specific as it. It's basically now he's planning to establish a multi-stakeholder advisory body on global AI cooperation. But again, the word here is advisory. It is not to make policy, but it's an advisory board. And this is basically to look at inclusion, to look at coordination, to look at capacity building, but not at rules and regulations. And the rules and regulations establishment is really the prerogative, as I mentioned, of the member states, of the sovereign member states. And they are absolutely saying this is so important because the SG or the special envoy, they can prod, they can cajole, they can exhort, but they can't actually take the measures. And that's really interesting to see what will happen, particularly when it now comes to these UNESCO recommendations that they're so very proud of having established. But the thing is that who's going to monitor if anyone will even follow these recommendations? Who's going to monitor what's the outcome of it? Because that's where the rubber hits the road. You need to have basically maybe even goalposts or maybe even certain measuring points as to what comes out of these recommendations. Otherwise, they're just not worth the paper that they're written on. And when you look at, and I mentioned this earlier, when you look at the lethal autonomous weapon systems, this was something that came out of the Human Rights Council initially, but on the other hand, there's been a number of bodies that have been established in Geneva since 2013, 9 years now. And basically, these were to establish rules to outlaw lethal autonomous weapon systems. And that's a very concrete example of one specific subfield, if you want. But there is, until now, 9 years, there's absolutely no concrete agreement that would lead to a treaty. And the latest example to start negotiations failed in December. And frankly, I don't think it's going to happen. And there's a broad agreement on key issues. But on the other hand, there's a total divide between 6 countries on the one side, and that's like Australia, Canada, Korea, Japan, UK, and the US. And then there is another group that basically says a non-binding set of principles is simply not enough. So where do you go with that? 9 years later, you really cannot see that there's going to be progress. The only way you're going to make progress is if you take it outside of the UN and you basically start another treaty negotiation with some member states that are interested, but that does not mean that it's going to have universal acceptance. And that's basically a part of it. Now, what I find very interesting is when states' assets are threatened, and this is really very, very important, then it is much easier to arrive at concrete steps. And here you have, for example, this EU Cyber Resilience Act, which was recently adopted, and that's basically damages of, 5 trillion European euros or something like that. But on the other hand, when it is this assets are threatened, then it is possible to make progress. But other than that, it really is not. So I think that then you can have progress, but on the other hand, you cannot. There's also cyber discussions within the United Nations. There have been some progress has been made, and that's been going on for quite some time. But on the other hand, it is very, very difficult to make any binding rules that are applicable. The one rule that was made applicable was basically that the law on the land, so to say, is also applicable to cyberspace. Now, that was something that I found very interesting, and that's the only one. And after that happened, and I think it was in 2014, the states drew back very quickly because they felt that had already gone too far. It's not a treaty, but it's an agreement that was made. So you can make progress, but it's extremely, extremely difficult.
Thank you, Angela, and it's an incredible privilege for us to have your, as it were, insights in terms of your experience to be able to draw on in these kind of big international questions and in terms of your background. Elham, what do you make of this debate? What do you think in terms of, you know, the kind of work you're doing, technical standards? Is that something that can be very neutral and applied across more broadly, or is it something that actually will be quite difficult in terms of achieving in practice on a global scale?
Yeah, thank you for the questions, and I really hope so. I think regardless of the policy, regulatory landscapes, technical standards, specifications that have been developed on a consensus way, they can really be the core for let it be regulations and compliance, checking in a regulatory mechanisms, or through voluntary frameworks such as what NIST is doing. So I'm thinking that the technical standards that provides the shared understandings and interoperable lexicon to communicate risks, but also metrics and methodologies for measurement and assessments of risks and trustworthy AI could really help advance different policy regulatory landscapes, but also again voluntary frameworks like NIST. And I we sometimes get this question that what's the enforcement? How a voluntary framework can actually do anything? And our answer to that is we don't want AI RMF to be a checklist, and we think that the checklist would not really achieve the goal of true risk management. Any of these documents, the implementation of that or the compliance to that should be based on the value that they provide. So one of the things that we're trying to do with the AI risk management is cultivating a culture of understanding risk, measuring and managing risk. And I think that can be a powerful message to bring technology developers, designers, users, but also the whole different members of the society into the conversations, because everybody is united in the goal of maximizing the benefits of this technology and minimizing the risk of that. So just like Angela, I stay hopeful. I see the glass half full, and I think that this type of contributions, good standards and interoperable benchmarks and test beds that allows us to do measurements on the different aspects of trustworthiness of the AI can lead into more aligned and harmonized approaches, regardless of the policy and regulatory landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Elham. Hiroaki, I'm so excited to hear your perspective on this question as a senior leader in a large global corporation dealing with this issue. What's your perspective on this question of different national or international regulatory standards?
Well, thank you very much. I think regulating AI at the unified global thing is at least at this moment it's very infeasible, frankly speaking. I mean, I think we need to really identify what are the things we don't really want to see happening, right? So then I think how you're going to safeguard would be the kind of thing like people, each government may be able to do, and probably bring it to the table the international agreement. That's basically it's more or less like a fundamental human rights infringement using this kind of technology, or like a privacy breaching. Those are things which most likely at the same time, even that might have like a different interpretation in different countries as well. At the same time, from the corporate aspect, corporate wants to do not wants to disgrace their brand. They just want to have like a very good reputations. That is the good corporate citizens, and then have like a best practice in the AI. Who the corporate has like a really good in-depth understand technology and make a best use for that for the society. And that's what the corporate will establish their brand value. So, in large corporations, they are very sensitive about like how you do the artificial intelligence. For example, like some of the US companies stop using a facial recognition technology because that actually had the risk of breaching the privacy, or like depending on how they set the training data, they might have like ethical ethnic bias as well, because like some of the people in specific ethnic background may not have like a sufficiently training data, then the face recognition accuracy is going down for that specific subpopulation as well. So like there are all kind of technical issues that or prevent like corporates to deploy the AI in a specific area and in the protection of the corporate image as well. At the same time, what the other issue of having like all the regulatory approach instead of a soft law approach is technology changing very rapidly as well. I mean, AI technology is not really saturating. It's making like yet another accelerations and recent years as well. So we start seeing, as I said, like a foundation model. We start seeing all kind of quantum jump, I would say, in terms of what the AI can do. So, 5 years from now, the landscape for technology may be quite different from what we are looking at today. So the, creating like strict regulatory standard or will impede the advancement technology, or that may be made absolutely obsolete because of the dramatic change in technology in the coming years. So I think like a best thing we can do is continue to have a forum of discussion to see what's going on, what are the possible like a best practice, or what are the risk factors, and then if there's a specific agreement emerging, then we should really try to get a viable agreement in that case. But at the same time, like we're predicting what kind of legal framework, overall governing framework at the global level at this moment seems to be very infeasible at this moment. So at the same time, like it's, as I said, like it's very useful to have like a global forum for the discussions, the potential misuse of technology, or what is the best use of the, this technology is extremely useful thing to do. We should have like a community that keep discussing that kind of use, like for best use of AI and what are the possible risks.
Thank you very much indeed, Hiroaki. And I promised at the beginning of our session that I'd leave plenty of space for audience Q&A, and we've just finished in time for having about 15 minutes of different questions from the audience. Now, there are loads and loads of interesting questions coming in, so I'm really quite torn. What I might do is throw 3 of my favorite questions I've seen so far out there, and then invite Elham, Angela, and Hiroaki to maybe pick the 1 or 2 you're most interested in as a sort of quick fire round to go around. As I say, we've got 15 minutes, so I'll put all 3 questions out there, and then you can pick which ones you want to focus on. So question number 1 is, can you give us any examples of national policies on AI, whether it's regulations or other policies, that have proven really useful to address ethical considerations as well as skills gaps? Which country or countries offer best practices we can learn from? So I think really interesting, Hiroaki, this turns to your earlier point, what can we learn from different best practice questions? The second one, what could enforcement mechanisms look like for international AI agreements? I'm not going to lie, as a lawyer, when Angela was saying earlier, you can have these nice international standards, but at some point, the rubber needs to hit the road. That's exactly what we as lawyers think of very much, is, how do we turn standards into actual norms, whether ex ante or ex post facto, in terms of the enforcement. And the third one that I also think quite interesting is to what extent should people like diplomats at the UN go to AI boot camps at a place like MIT or other leading universities? Do we need a sort of better understanding of technologies at the odds of international agreements. From my personal perspective, we 3 years ago launched a course jointly between the computer science department and the law faculty in Oxford, and it was really difficult, but really great fun actually working with students, and every course is taught by one person from computer science, one person from law. I think that's really interesting. The idea is not to turn lawyers into computer scientists or vice versa, but just to get this sort of common language. So again, it'd be really interesting to hear what our panelists make of those 3 questions.
You want me to go first? I'll be happy to.
You go ahead, please do.
Okay. I'll start by the question on enforcement, and I'll say that we really think that the enforcement, again, I said that we don't want AI RMF to be a checklist because we want to provide value, and the use and implementations and adaptations of this type of frameworks would be based on the value that they provide. And the value that they provide is a structured, measurable, flexible way to maximize the benefits of AI and minimize the risk of AI. The risk can be, and the risk of the AI, I think it was also mentioned at the beginning, is not any different than the risk of other information technology sectors, security, privacy, all those. But AI comes, as we all know, with some unique risks to itself. So the enforcement really becomes the value that they provide for for all of us, for everybody to be able to benefit the potentials of the AI systems. And the point about boot camps for the lawyers, I do believe that, you know, expanding the educations, and all of our engineers know a little bit about law, and all of our lawyers can know something about coding, could be helpful and beneficial. But I think the right approach, and there's a lot of emphasis in the AI RMF about that, is having multidisciplinary team of different expertise and different part of the society, having that inclusive, diverse team, and open up to different point of view and different knowledge would really make the discussions about risk and risk management much richer and much more effective and efficient. And with that, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Let me go next, and let me go on to the boot camps. I want to give you an example. When I was still in the UN, and this was at the early part when these discussions on the lethal autonomous weapons system started, I had basically seen exactly the point that you had raised, Jeremias, about, you know, diplomats don't really have the right formation, they don't have the right training, they don't have the right understanding, they need help to basically kind of know what is exactly involved. And so I had asked a very prominent, a very leading AI company, which is based in the UK, I think you might know who that is, to come to Geneva and basically provide some training, to provide some information on the diplomats. And they basically went to Geneva and sort of said, yes, here we are, and we can do this, and it's fine, and etc., paid for their own. And in the end, they were given 20 minutes in a meeting. And they turned to me and they sort of said, that's just not worth it for us. We're not going to spend the time. We're not going to spend the money to do that. So there has to be a different approach. I think that, yes, it is a good approach, but the question is, how do you actually implement it? What I think would be really, really important is to have kind of a surveying the landscape, as I would say. I mean, what is the status of AI in a number of countries? And I'm saying that because the developing countries and those that do not have a high let's say, profile in AI. They certainly don't have any AI industries. You know, they have users of AI in terms of the algorithms, etc. But that's really all. But it would be really useful to know sort of what is it, because this becomes really important later on. And by that, I mean, is if you look at, for example, what's happening in outer space, you know, now countries are saying, you know, we don't have the money to shoot up satellites. There are others who are monopolizing all of this. So basically, you know, where are we in all of this? Where's the equity? Where is the justice? You know, we need to have access to this as well. And the same question you have right now with all of the climate change, because the countries that basically are the victims of climate change, which has been occasioned and which has been brought about by the countries which have basically put out carbon dioxide in the environment and everything, that's coming back to haunt you. So I would argue very strongly to, yes, by all means, do some training, let's see if that's acceptable, survey the landscape, what is needed, and also what countries want. Because if you do want to have some kind of a normative framework or some kind of an approach as to what you can do, sectoral or otherwise, that's really what you need to start somewhere. And that start is not happening.
Thank you, Angela. And Hiroaki, that means over to
let
you.
me take this ethical use question. But I think this is very interesting. Although we don't have like kind of international agreement and regulatory standard on the ethical use, but there are consensus building up on some of the technology, how they should be used. Not like everyone agrees around the globe, but like general consensus on the, for example, like a face recognition technology, which became really the issue in rather in the early stage, is like a typical agreement at this moment. You have to have first of all, on a training data, you have to balance training data on the gender and ethnic background. So otherwise, like specific ethnic group or have like a disadvantage on the misrecognition or improper treatment. That is like one thing that became like a very obvious in a very early in a stage. At the same time, whether the face recognition should be used in the law enforcement authorities or not, that is actually another issue. And then some of the growing consensus is because when it was used at the law enforcement agencies, people have like no choice. People are not given a choice because it's around, right? So since the people is not given a choice, it's not may not be appropriate to use this kind of technology and the law enforcement. And if the private sector use this technology for like some kind of a surveillance or monitoring of the shops and other places, that people, well, of course, like it depends on what kind of company use it. People, for example, if it's shown, that some shops using a face recognition technology, people can actually refuse to get into the shops or complain about it. So like this time, people have some kind of choice. So I think it really depends on the how people can make a decisions on the whether you want to actually in a place that the establishment have like a face recognition technology, how they're gonna use it. If that became like a transparent, there are way for the people to actually make decisions and whether you want to get involved in that or not. But at the same time, if the government sector use that, and but basically people don't have a choice. So I think like there's an interesting discussion going on in terms of the use of technology and how the technology built it properly. At the same time, whether the people citizens are given a choice or not, it seems to have like a quite substantial implication of the use of technology. And there's but at the same time, it's not every countries agree on that. So like I can foresee the countries who actually has the using the face recognition technologies like everywhere for the law enforcement as well. So it's very difficult, almost impossible to have like a universal consensus on this. But at the same time, like for the like-minded countries and in sectors, we start having a growing consensus in a specific area as well. So I think like this ethical standard is the we start seeing the progress. At the same time, it's still very limited at this moment.
Thank you very much indeed, Hiroaki. And I fear, looking at the clock, we've just come to the end of the panel. I think it's fair to say, despite our really interesting and wide-ranging discussions, there's plenty more we could discuss. But I think one of the things for me that has come out very, very clearly in our conversation over the last hour and a bit is the importance of recognizing just how complex the various questions are that we're thinking about here. And I think as a result of that, and again, I'm really grateful to all my panelists for this, I think we should be really careful of sort of false binaries that sometimes characterize these debates, whether it's casting the debate as a question of tensions between national approaches and global technologies, whether it's casting as a tension between innovation and regulation, as a tension between the very distinct political economies we've talked about. I think one thing that I've really learned from our panel today is that in reality, the solution often lies in finding the right trade-offs here and having these exchanges across policy, academia, and industry is critical to this end. And so that's why I hope very much that we'll have many more occasions like today's AI Policy Forum to come together and continue our conversations. On which happy note, thank you very much indeed to everyone in the global audience. Thank you for your questions. Thank you in particular to our brilliant panelists, Elham, Tabassi, Hiroaki, Kitano, and Angela Kane. And also to everyone at MIT, especially Greg Dreyfus and his entire team for his support in the run-up to this event. And also to Louis, Alexander, and Dan for bringing us all together. That's it from us. Thank you very much indeed. I think over to Alexander to take us to the rest of an exciting and interesting day. Goodbye.
Great, thank you. This was a really insightful conversation. So just to say a little bit about what kind of sounded for me, I think on the one hand, there was this kind of clear need for having a broader conversation and even the same language when we talk about AI policy around the world. On the other hand, there was this recognition that this conversation is not just among a handful of countries, that we really, every country should be heard here and should be a material part of these conversations. And of course, as already Jeremiah says, it's like an insanely complex landscape that we are dealing with here. So, in particular, different countries have a very different cultures of thinking about AI, different political way of trying to approach them. And, there are also economical aspects that make it very different proposition for different countries. So I just want to thank you, Angela, Hiroaki, Elham. This was really, really great. And, last but definitely not least, thank you, Jeremiah. This was an excellent moderation.